The document-based question, the DBQ, is the free response question that is worth the most, 25% of your total AP score, and it is the question that most ably assesses a student's ability to analyze and interpret documents and to develop a valid and defensible historical thesis. In this lesson, we'll review the AP's rubric expectations for the DBQ. While the main purpose of the DBQ is to assess a student's ability to work with documents, the DBQ does require students to demonstrate their historical comprehension, and requiring the historical contextualization of the prompt is one way that comprehension is assessed. Historical context refers to the various conditions that surround the development that is the focus of the prompt. These conditions help to explain the urgency of the development. Maybe they help to emphasize the development's importance or even its timing. After reading the prompt, ask yourself, what was happening at the time of this development that sheds some light on it? The specific conditions that are appropriate to address will depend on the prompt itself. One way to think about which conditions to address is to consider the acronym Geosprite, which stands for Geographical, Social, Political, Religious, Intellectual, Technological, and Economic. In other words, ask yourself, are geographical conditions important to discuss for this prompt? If so, what geographical conditions existed at this time? What about social conditions, political ones, and so on? Now, it's not enough to just identify the conditions which existed. Context isn't just a list of these conditions. In order to earn the contextualization point, you have to both identify and explain these conditions. You want to take the time to connect these conditions to the historical event or development that is the focus of the prompt. In order to ensure that you earn this point, you should make sure you address at least 2 or 3 conditions and explain how they're connected to the development. Your contextualization should be the opening sentences of your first introductory paragraph. The heart of the DBQ is the argument, the claim you make and support in response to the prompt. You introduce your argument with your thesis. Your thesis should be the last 1 or 2 sentences of your first paragraph. That means it should be included in the same paragraph as your historical contextualization. Your thesis is the statement which clearly identifies your claim and then clearly addresses the prompt. In making your thesis clear, you need to state which historical development you're exploring and when, and, if necessary, where. Remember that your thesis is an argument, so make sure that you take a clear stand. And make sure you explain yourself. Why are you taking that particular stand? The explanation you'll need to make for your thesis becomes clearer once you've had the chance to review the documents for possible evidence. The second part of your argument is the evidence you use to support your thesis. For the DBQ, your evidence comes mostly from the documents provided, but you are also required to provide at least one example of evidence beyond the documents. Let's talk about evidence from the documents first. You'll get 7 documents to work with on the DBQ. These documents have been carefully selected and excerpted to ensure that they allow for a variety of arguments. This means that the documents can be used in different ways to support varying arguments. However, it is possible for students to misread or misunderstand a document and thus use it incorrectly. So students have to be careful when reading, and you need to make sure that they comprehend the document before attempting to use that document to support any argument. On the DBQ, you need to use at least 6 of the 7 documents as evidence in order to earn the 2 possible evidence from the documents EFD points. You can earn 1 EFD point if you use between 3 and 5 documents as evidence. In order to be sure you're using a document as evidence and not just summarizing the document, you have to think about how the document helps you address the prompt. That means you have to interpret the document. Because the documents form the backbone of your evidence, It's suggested that you not develop a thesis until you've read through all of the documents and have thought about how each document helps you address the prompt. As you read through the documents, you should take note of patterns among the documents. Do any of the documents seem to have similar interpretations? Are any of the documents from the same region? Are the authors of any documents connected in some way? Think about the ways you can group or categorize the documents. Doing so will help you determine the organization of your essay. Each body paragraph can discuss how the documents included in that category address the prompt. The third evidence point is awarded for providing evidence beyond the documents, evidence that supports your claim but that isn't found in any of the documents provided. You usually only have to provide one additional piece of evidence beyond the documents to earn the point, but if you have more additional evidence to provide, then you should do so. Adding evidence only strengthens your argument. As you're working to understand the documents, one of the important aspects of interpretation is sourcing. The DBQ rubric requires students to explain sourcing for 3 of the 7 documents in order to earn the sourcing point. Sourcing refers to understanding and explaining the ways that a document's authorship or placement in history affects the content of the document. Addressing a document's sourcing always starts with reading and understanding a document's source line. There are a number of ways to approach explaining a document's sourcing. One way is to consider who the document's author is and how that person's characteristics, maybe their gender or their ethnicity or their occupation, affected the content of the document. This kind of sourcing focuses on the author's human perspective. In the same way that who we are affects our understanding of the world around us and how we might portray that understanding in writing, a historical person's understanding of an event or development will also be affected by who they are. For this document on screen, you may or may not know who Cicero was, but you do know that he was a high-class person who served as a political leader and who wrote a book. So how might Cicero's position as an upper-class person and a political leader affect what he's written? Another way to consider sourcing, and one that's often closely tied to the author's perspective, is to consider the author's motivation. Why did they feel the need to create this document? Might their motivation be tied to their occupation? Were they hired to create the document? Might their motivation be tied to their nationality? Are they trying to appeal to other people of the same background? Or might it be tied to their political affiliation? That is, do they want to convince other people to join their cause? In this document, the author's motivation is perhaps very obvious. The excerpt begins with the words, "I request." But identifying that isn't enough. Connect it to his perspective. We know this author is a Han government official. So ask yourself, why might a government official be making this request? A third way to consider sourcing is to determine the intended audience for the document. A document's intended audience is sometimes stated in the source line, but often you'll need to determine this for yourself. So ask yourself, to whom is the author presenting this document? How does that specific audience affect what's written? For instance, if you're writing something to your best friend, you're probably not going to worry too much about grammar and spelling. You might not worry very much about the organization of an email. Is it multiple paragraphs or just one long paragraph? Who cares? You might add references to inside jokes or emojis, or you might use language that you don't use with anyone else. So what's unique about this document that helps us understand who the intended audience is? Of course, if you're preparing an essay that you'll submit for a grade, then you probably will be focused on grammar and spelling as well as organization. You'll likely not use any sort of questionable language like curse words, and you'll probably be careful to use a third-person point of view instead of a first-person point of view. Since your intended audience affects how you compose your document, this is a valid way of addressing sourcing. In this particular document, we have to figure out who the audience might be. We know from the source line that this is from a government-sponsored history. So ask yourself, for whom might a government want to publish a history book? And why? The last way to consider sourcing is to think about what was happening at the time that the document was created, and how those conditions may have affected the development of that document. This is considering historical context, but unlike the contextualization point for the DBQ, which asks you to consider the context of an entire historical development, sourcing by historical context asks you to consider what was happening in the years around when a document was created. To do sourcing this way, look at the place and the year or time frame in which a document was created, and search your historical comprehension to see if you can think of any conditions that may have affected the document. For instance, if a document was written in England in 1776, we might consider how the American Revolution, which began the year before, may have affected the creation of that document, and you might explain how. If a document was written in the United States in October of 2001, we might consider how the attacks of 9/11 may have affected the creation of that October document. The last DBQ rubric expectation is without doubt the hardest to earn. This expectation, which we affectionately call complexity, assesses a student's ability to demonstrate a complex understanding of the development which is the focus of the prompt. A student can do this by using evidence to corroborate, qualify, or modify their argument. This is demonstrated with more than a passing reference or a single sentence. A student has to take the time to really show that they understand multiple facets of the historical development. One way of demonstrating complex understanding is by examining the nuances of multiple variables within that historical development. Depending on the prompt, this might include analyzing both similarities and differences between developments, or explaining both continuities and changes within the development. A student might also explain multiple causes for the development, or arrange those causes on a spectrum of effects. A student's ability to work through the nuances of a development effectively demonstrates complex understanding of that development. Another way to demonstrate complex understanding is by identifying and explaining insightful connections within and across periods with respect to the historical development in question. For instance, a student might note that the development they've been examining is similar to a different development that occurred previously in another place, and then they take the time to explain the similarities they see between those two developments. It's not enough to identify a plausible connection, you must explain it fully in order to earn the point for complexity. A final way to demonstrate complex understanding is by qualifying or modifying the original argument that you made to take diverse or alternative views or evidence into account. This is the most impressive method of earning complexity because the student often has to demonstrate significant historical comprehension about the time period in order to realize that the development might have been interpreted differently by different populations. And the student has to provide additional evidence beyond the documents to fully support the modification of their original thesis. Students who successfully modify their argument have absolutely demonstrated their complex understanding of this historical development. And so we have the various rubric expectations for the DBQ. Contextualization of the historical development in question, thesis, an historically defensible argument in response to the prompt, evidence from the documents, using at least 6 of the documents, evidence beyond the documents, the inclusion of at least one piece of outside evidence to support the thesis, sourcing, addressing the sourcing of at least 3 documents, and complexity, demonstrating a complex understanding of the historical development in question. As we continue through this course and learn and practice the individual skills that make up the DBQ rubric, make sure you take the time to become proficient in and/or master the argumentation skills, contextualization, thesis, and evidence from the documents, before you work on the additional skills of sourcing and complexity. Review your graded work, not just your graded essays, to see how you're doing with these basic skills, and make sure that you ask your teacher for help and additional practice if you feel the need.